Ro Khanna, a Democrat, and not just a Democrat, but a progressive who refuses to take money from corporate donors and who co-chaired the 2020 presidential campaign of one Bernie Sanders. How does a guy like that reconcile his progressive values with those of his big tech constituents? That's just one of the seeming contradictions that Khanna tackles in a new book out now, Dignity in a Digital Age, Making Tech Work for All of Us. Khanna gets that tech has the power to deepen our inequalities and poison our discourse, but he still believes tech has the power to transform every American's life for the better. His book is a sweeping manifesto for something like a tech New Deal. He proposes new regional tech hubs and low-cost internet for all to bring back rural jobs and communities. And he calls on big tech firms to accept greater responsibility for connecting citizens instead of just chasing engagement or personal data. Khanna finds a lot to like in Silicon Valley's culture of innovation, but he's not afraid to propose federal laws to make its workforce more diverse and equitable. It's all a part of his self-identification as a progressive capitalist. Quote, "We are for freedom, not just from state overreach, but also freedom to live up to one's potential." So what exactly does that kind of progressive capitalism look like? And how realistic is its vision? Let's ask the man himself. Congressman Ro Khanna of California joins me now. His new book is Dignity in a Digital Age, Making Tech Work for All of Us. Congressman, thanks for coming on the show. Fascinating new book from you. On the one hand, you argue for tech in every community based on that community's shared values and culture. On the other hand, you stress the need for tech firms to boost racial and gender diversity to work with the LGBTQ community, among others. How is that supposed to work in, say, Southwest Virginia or East Tennessee, where local communities are banning books from schools that contain the lived experiences of people of color, of gays, lesbians, and trans people?
Well, Mehdi, one of the most interesting things when I went to Beckley, West Virginia, is the most popular instructor there was actually a Pakistani American, an immigrant, and she was helping teach computer science to some of these young kids. And so the hope is that creating technology jobs, and that's not just coding jobs, they may be manufacturing jobs, maybe retail jobs, may create some of the interconnections where people are connected to modern prosperity. Now, that's not a panacea for the racial issues or the gender issues or the social issues, but the argument is that if you're prospering together, working together, maybe that reduces some of the bitterness and some of the division.
So, Congressman, what if more tech is not a good thing in these communities? You're talking about a sector, after all, that's done immeasurable harm to our democracy and our economy and our discourse and our young people. Why would you want to replicate that model across the whole country?
Well, there's no doubt that it has to be reformed, but let's look at both sides of technology. Just this week, for example, everyone on the Hill is talking about this Instagram account that has staff members talking about their experience anonymously, saying the working conditions aren't great. Now, there is no way that would happen if it weren't for social media, and neither would the Me Too movement, neither would the Black Lives Matter movement. So there's positive to it. There's also huge abuse with the data collection. There's abuse with the incitement to violence. There's abuse in terms of these platforms being exclusive. So my view is let's have an Internet Bill of Rights, and I argue for reforms of how we make technology better public discourse. But to say that we just shouldn't have it, I think, is to throw out too many of the democratizing aspects of giving people speech.
I guess it's not about just shouldn't have it. I guess it's, as you say, it needs reform. Why not reform it first before you try and send it around America? And I would add, as you concede in the book, tech's multiplier effect, you say, does not lift all boats. There's a lot of evidence out there that tech build-up in a community deepens racial segregation, deepens gentrification. How do you fix that?
Well, 2 points. One, the technology jobs are going to exist. There are 25 million of them. The reality is that the digitization has created $11 trillion of market value in my district. And what I'm saying is those 25 million jobs shouldn't all be in my district. We shouldn't have GM hiring tech workers to build cars in Silicon Valley. We shouldn't have all the semiconductors being built in a few cities. It's good that they're being built in Ohio. So digitization is a fact of life, and I'm arguing that every community should have access to those jobs and that prosperity suited to that community. Now, you're right to say that there are some huge issues in Silicon Valley. One of them has been not enough focus on housing. service workers' wages have not kept up. Many of them are rent burdened. And this is something that people will have to grapple with as they start new communities. Frankly, for many parts of the country, the property values are so depressed that that's a ways off. But they would be wise to learn the lessons of the Valley, make sure they embrace unionization of service workers, make sure workers have a seat on the board, make sure they realize that 2/3 of people still don't use a laptop for their jobs, and they have affordable housing policy, and so that you have the digital prosperity actually benefiting everyone, which it currently does not.
Listening to you speak, you kind of sounded like a congressional equivalent of a turkey voting for Christmas. All the jobs shouldn't be in my district. I've never heard a member of Congress say they don't want all the jobs in their district. That's a first on this show. Congressman, I want to play for you a short montage of questions from lawmakers in some big tech hearings. Have a listen.
Will you commit to ending Finsta?
Senator, again, let me explain. We don't actually do Finsta. What Finsta refers to is young people setting up accounts where they may want to have more privacy.
Will you end that type of account?
I'm not sure I understand exactly what you're asking.
We provide a number of different services.
Is Twitter the same as what you do?
Well, how do you sustain a business model in which users don't pay for your service?
Senator, we run ads.
You write a lot about how a big problem is tech literacy in America, but it's not just the public, is it? As you point out in the book, a lot of your fellow lawmakers on Capitol Hill, both Republican and Democrat, struggle to wrap their heads around a lot of this stuff.
Well, I often joke that it's only the United States Congress that could make Mark Zuckerberg in any way look sympathetic. But look, Senator Blumenthal was actually getting at a serious question. He's talking about these fake Instagram accounts. And I think what he's driving at is, how do we know that people under 13 aren't creating these accounts? And these sites should make sure that young kids aren't on them. On the other hand, there may be some value in having anonymous accounts for teenagers who don't want to have everything monitored by their family, especially if you have certain things that you want some privacy on. The point is that the details here matter, the nuance matters, and if members of Congress aren't able to show the public that they get this stuff, then they won't be trusted to regulate it. I'm not saying they have to understand how to be a software engineer or understand the business model, but it's like, if you want to make the rules of the road, you should have driven in a car. You should have at least been in the passenger seat. And a lot of members of Congress aren't on these platforms. They don't have a wallet, and they're talking about cryptocurrency. Just do it for a week. Have an immersive experience so you know what you're talking about when regulating digital life.
Having said that, I should also say, and you're right, you're making, in the general point, you're right, but of course, we had a president who spent a lot of time on social media, but that didn't help him understand it at all. In your book, you talk a lot about building consensus online, including with conservatives and Republicans, especially around scientific facts and technology. And you write this: Chris Buskirk, the conservative publisher of the journal American Greatness and staunch supporter of former President Donald Trump, shared with me that he is optimistic about the potential for broad agreement on environmental policy if the language is not overblown. Shockingly, almost no progressives or Democrats have ever reached out to him to discuss crafting an environmental agenda. Congressman, sounds nice, but I just want to share with you a few tweets posted by American Greatness in recent days. Just after 11 today, Biden admin to pay for crack pipes, heroin for addicts. A while before that, like Sollozzo in The Godfather, Anthony Fauci's business is drugs. I could add a few more anti-vax tweets in there too. I know you like bipartisanship, but are these really the kind of people that liberals should be trying to sell their environmental agenda, their science agenda to?
Well, there's no doubt that a lot of the modern public sphere has been distorted by money and special interests, and it's not this ideal form of deliberation. But with Chris Buskirk in particular, he talked about appealing to some conservatives by invoking this idea that people should be good stewards of the land, by invoking the idea that that is actually part of people's faith, and that is something that farmers take seriously, and involving them in the conversation. And my point is, where possible, to have community and conversation as Matt Russell does in church basements, actually, in Iowa, and gets farmers to care about climate and gets them to understand that, yeah, they maybe should be paid for having regenerative agriculture. Where possible, we ought to do that. And that works better in sort of small communities, small groups than on mass forums.
I get the argument in theory. I get the argument that there are tens of millions of Americans who voted for Trump. You can't just not speak to them or, communicate with them. I get all that. But in the real world, in the modern 2022 America, you have groups like American Greatness pushing anti-vaxxer, anti-science, anti-climate, racist, bigoted nonsense. I know you've worked with Matt Gaetz before on a common goal towards trying to end some endless wars. But at what point do you say, you know what, I just need to have a hygiene test. I cannot be working with people who support insurrection, who push white supremacy openly. There's got to be a line that I don't cross. Do you have a line that you don't cross when it comes to working with Republicans?
There is. I mean, look, I think if someone is elected to be a member of Congress, you have to work with them in the context that they represent a constituency. But that doesn't mean that you have to compromise your principles. That doesn't mean that when it comes to saying that the insurrection is wrong, that there's a need to entertain multiple perspectives, or saying racism is wrong, that there's a need to entertain multiple perspectives. I guess my temperament is to engage as much in dialogue as possible. It's influenced probably by my grandfather, who spent 4 years in jail in Gandhi's independence movement, and that was sort of at the heart of Gandhi's teaching. Now, do I probably go overboard at times? Sure, but that's a judgment call. But I don't compromise what I think is right or wrong.
Well, having a Gandhi follower grandfather is certainly an inspiration, though I would argue that the modern GOP makes the British Empire look very reasonable. You're on the House Armed Services Committee. You're well known for your foreign policy stances and your criticism of endless wars. What is your position on what's going on in Ukraine in relation to Russia? Should the United States be ruling things out, like NATO membership for Ukraine, to de-escalate? Do you have any suggestions of your own on how to de-escalate?
Well, first, we need to be very clear that Putin's aggression is wrong, that there's absolutely no justification for it, and that we stand with Ukraine. That said, I think we ought to be for diplomacy, and we should look at everything on the table on diplomacy. I've said that before, that the reality is when Bush promised NATO membership, that in some sense was a false promise. I mean, there was no intention to have that happen. It hasn't happened yet. And so we ought to be realistic, as a lot of people have, about what we actually are going to commit to, and see if we can de-escalate with negotiation and really negotiate in the situation, recognizing that Putin is clearly in the moral wrong, and there's absolutely no justification for his argument.
Yeah, it's a very dangerous moment right now, and I worry that we are in a moment where those of us who call for de-escalation are immediately tarred or smeared as Putin apologists, or, to quote the White House press secretary, parroting Russian talking points. And I'm old enough, as you are, to remember the Iraq War, remember what happened in this town in Washington, D.C., when people tried to speak out against the Iraq War and were tarred as Saddam Hussein apologists, and we know how that worked out. So I'm glad there are voices like yourself still talking about de-escalation. The book is called Dignity in a Digital Age, Making Tech Work for All of Us. Congressman Ro Khanna, thank you for your time, as ever.